Howdy. You're all probably accustomed to hearing that Aggieland greeting in a harsh Brooklyn accent. But from now on, at least when you come to the Humphrys lectures, you're going to hear it spoken with no accent at all, which is how those of us from Wisconsin speak. We have no accent whatsoever. Good evening. My name's Michael Desch. I'm a professor at the George Bush School. I hold the Robert M. Gates Chair in Intelligence and National Security Decision-Making, and I'm also honored to have been named the first director of the Brent Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. We'll be officially opening the Institute on Saturday morning with a ribbon cutting that'll be part of the Gala 10th anniversary celebrations of the library and the Bush School. And I've got a note here in my notes to remind people that if you'd like to join us for the 10th anniversary celebrations, there are still tickets available all over town here at the George Bush Library Museum and on main campus at MSC Rudder, KBTX, WTAW, Clear Channel Radio, and a number of other places around town. But tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Scowcroft Institute-sponsored Lenore and Francis Humphrys International Speakers Program. Before I get going, let me just make a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, if you'd be so kind to silence your cell phones or beepers or anything else that might make noise in the course of the talk. And secondly, if after our speaker's presentation you feel so moved as to ask a question or make a comment, we have microphones on either side of the center section, and we ask that you get in line for questions there. Let me also emphasize that these are questions or short comments and not a second speech, please. Before I introduce the man that's going to introduce tonight's speaker, let me say just a little bit about the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. Very briefly, the Scowcroft Institute has two missions. First, to help bring the world to the Bush School and to Texas A&M. And we have a number of programs that we sponsor to do that. The Lenore and Francis Humphrey Lectures series, which heretofore the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation administered, we've now taken over and will be doing 2 of those every year. And I can't promise we'll always have speakers as eminent as the one we'll have tonight, but we'll do our very best to bring some of the leading thinkers and practitioners of world affairs here to College Station. Secondly, the Bush School's monthly National Security Seminar series, a thing we do once a month to bring people of somewhat lesser renown, but we think every bit as informative to the Bush School, is something that we do regularly. And those are announced either through Aggie Hotline or through the Bush Library calendar. And we don't normally get as many people as we got tonight, but they're always open to the public, and we encourage you to join us. A third thing that the Scowcroft Institute is responsible for is the ANSWERY Foreign Policy Conference, a yearly conference. This year we did our first ANSWERY conference in connection with the George Bush 2007 U.S.-China conference in Washington, D.C. We did a breakout series on mill-to-mill relations, and it was a great success. And we'll be doing that on a yearly basis, most often here in College Station. And finally, the Scowcroft Institute is the host to what we hope will be a burgeoning Distinguished Fellows Program. This year, our first fellow is my colleague, Mike Absher, who's a retired Senior Intelligence Service level Directorate of Operations guy, and he's sort of breaking in the chair in an office for what we hope will be a long line of distinguished fellows. So that's what the Scowcroft Institute does to bring the world here, but we have a second mission. And the second mission is to try to bring the very best of the Bush School and Texas A&M University to the rest of the world. And we do that in three ways. We have a regular weekend seminar every year with the LBJ School at that nameless institution 90 miles west of here. I don't want anybody hissing in this event, which brings together the growing national security community in Texas, from Texas A&M, from UT Austin, from the Tower Center, and the Baker Institute at Rice. Secondly, the Scowcroft Institute is managing a new series of faculty research grants for Bush School faculty and for Texas A&M faculty that we call the Scowcroft Faculty Fellow, or the Faculty Research Fellowships. And through those, we hope to encourage our colleagues to be doing the sort of work that attract attention in a broad audience across the country. The final thing that we're doing is in connection with the Bush School's Master in Public and International Affairs degree program. The Scowcroft Institute is underwriting some of the terrific capstone projects that second-year Bush School International Affairs master's students have to do as part of their curriculum. And we've already had a terrific track record in capstones, which are projects that students do under the direction of faculty members for real-world clients. And we've worked for clients at the Congressional Research Service, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the National Intelligence Council, and a whole host of other clients that give our students terrific world experience and a leg up when they go out to make their way in the real world. But I've said enough about the Scowcroft Institute, and I want to turn to my real task this evening, which is to call upon a man who needs no introduction, especially here in his own presidential conference center and library facility, to introduce the Scowcroft Institute's inaugural Humphrys lecture. Mr. President.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Come on, guys. Howdy, down. Thank you all. I'm so glad you all are here, and I appreciated what Mike Desch said as he was talking about a part of this whole library and academia that means so much to me already, the Scowcroft Institute. Brent Scowcroft and I go back a long way. My first real interaction with him was when I was asked to be head of the CIA, and I was kind of babysat by Brent, who was then working for Kissinger. Awesome assignment, I might add. And he would kind of look over at what was going on at the CIA on behalf of the secretary, then the NSC advisor, and the president. So I worked with him and saw what I've found to be so true, that he's one of the brightest, most wonderful individuals I have ever met in my entire life. We're lucky that he has permitted his name to be identified with the Scowcroft Institute. Mike Desch is going to do a great job running it, and what he's outlined there is just a part of what's going to happen over the years here. And to have the name Scowcroft identified with the Bush Library means more than I could possibly tell you all, because of my strong friendship for him and the great limitless respect I have for Brent Scowcroft. He is the very best. You know, when he was National Security Advisor, he did it like the pros. He was bright as every one of the other people that we had working for us. Great Secretary of State, Jimmy Baker. Great Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. Great NSC guy, Colin Powell. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell. He could hold his own with all of them, but what he was an honest broker. And the National Security Advisor would have the awesome job of ironing out differences between these strong-willed members of the United States Cabinet or the CIA. And he'd get them in his office when they were arguing back and forth, and he had his own views, but he'd let each of them have their views. He tried to work out accommodation, and if that didn't work, he said, let's go down to the Oval Office. They walked the corridor past the Chief of Staff's office, come into my office, say, here are the options. Here's what Defense says. Here's what CIA says. Here's what the Joint Chiefs want. Here's the way the Secretary of State wants. And you got to decide this. We have to know this afternoon or by tomorrow. He would present it very fairly. I would then make a decision, often quietly getting his own personal opinion on the side. And then the good thing about it is he conducted the awesome job in such a way that we had very few people going out and feathering their own nest. Well, the stupid president down there didn't get this one right, and leaking and taking their case to the public instead of going along as a team. So as I was president, I was blessed by a pretty darn good teamwork, and I have always credited and will always credit the speaker today, General Brent Scowcroft, Lieutenant General, retired from the Air Force, a great man. It's all yours.
Howdy. At least I got that one right. Thank you, Mr. President, for those exceedingly generous words. The only thing I have to say is working for this man made anybody look good. It was a joy every day. I am delighted to be here to not only give the Humphrey lecture, but by a striking coincidence, to have it be the inaugural lecture for the Scowcroft Institute, of which I am enormously proud and which is totally undeserved, but that's another story. But faced with this sort of awesome event, the question is what to talk about. Well, it reminds me of the story of the doctor who got a call from the chairwoman of the local women's club and asked if he'd come and talk to the women's club on sex. And he said, sure, he'd be happy to. So the evening came and he was getting dressed and so on. His wife said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to talk to the women's club. She said, what about? And he was a little uneasy saying sex, so he said, sailing. So about a week after the lecture, the doctor's wife was walking down the street and she ran into the chairwoman of the women's club. And the lady said, oh, your husband gave us just the best lecture we have ever had. And the wife said, I don't understand why. He's only done it twice. The first time he threw up, and the second time he lost his hat. So anyway, that's the good part of what I'm going to say. I thought I would take this opportunity, instead of talking about the many exciting or dreadful things taking place around the world, to step back from the rush of problems of the moment that we're immersed with, talk a little bit about how we got where we are and what are some of the forces shaping the world that is presenting us with so many problems. And let me begin at the end of the Cold War, which for some of you students in the audience is already ancient history. because I think the end of the Cold War really marked a period of historical discontinuity in the structures and processes of the world environment. What do I mean by that? The world of the Cold War and that which followed almost instantaneously in a historical sense were the virtual polar opposites of each other. The Cold War was a world focused on the Soviet Union and its menace. It was an acute threat. It concentrated our mind. It concentrated all of our efforts, concentrated our institutions, everything toward a single target. Suddenly, that world was gone. And instead, there was a world out there with no huge threat, but a million little pinprick threats. And how do you deal with them? And that's partly what I want to talk about. That's not all, because the end of the Cold War, I think, also marked the end of World War I. Not World War II, World War I. Because World War I was a transforming event in world history. The world of the early 20th century was the first decade or so, was a world of great optimism. Science was progressing by leaps and bounds, and people were confidently saying that now we know so much, war is an anachronism. We're too smart to do anything so stupid anymore. Then came World War I, and that was a traumatic shock. And it also spawned the forces which beset us ever since that. The ideologies to reshape the world or mankind and so on. Communism, fascism, Nazism, all of them sprang out of World War I. World War I also marked the collapse of the last of the world's great empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. And if you look at the most troubled part of the world today, starting with the Balkans, into the Middle East, into Central Asia, that's where those empires disappeared. And the people of those empires are now still sort of searching for a comfortable governing structure, and in some cases even borders, whether it's Yugoslavia, Turkey, the new states of the Middle East, Jordan, Israel, the stands in Central Asia. This is a very important period. Now, of course, many of these changes took place much more gradually than the end of the Cold War, but a number of them were masked by the sharp confrontation of the Cold War and became apparent only after the Soviet Union had disappeared. So we're living now in a world undergoing fundamental readjustment, beset by forces released by the changes that I've described so far, as well as some others, some fundamental forces at work with the evolving natural structure of the world. Let me discuss just a few of those, of which there are many, but I want to concentrate on three. And the first is a change in the nature of war. When you use the term war, most people think of wars of countries or groups of countries fighting each other. Uniforms, flags, battles, peace treaties, and so on. That's what war generally means. Interstate war. But interstate war now may be almost anachronistic, because as we look forward, the most likely kind of conflict is not that war, but war inside states, civil wars, or wars between state and non-state actors. Very different kind of conflicts. And all of this is taking place just at a time when we in the United States have reached a new peak in our capability to fight the World War II kind of wars. We're really great at it, as we saw in Iraq this last time, where we defeated the strongest army in the Middle East in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. One other thing, the use of the term war, as in the war on terror, because of this, may put into our minds an inappropriate mental framework to think about the current radical threat that we face. Because this war doesn't have soldiers in uniform, doesn't have flags on. And we need to look at it in a different way. The second change is the distribution of power in the world. Probably not since the Roman Empire has any one state had so much military and economic power compared to other states in the world as the United States has. Now, this really happened in 1945, not with the end of the Cold War. But again, it was masked by the Soviet Union and its nuclear weapons, allowing it to be a superpower for the time. But now it's apparent. And a couple of things. First of all, we're not used to that. We're not used to being out in front of leading the world. Because for most of our history, secure behind our 2 oceans, we let others take the lead, primarily the European powers. And we sat back and decided whether or not to join the struggles, and if so, how, or whether to stay out. But others set the framework. Others set the world environment, which then we either joined or didn't join. And now they're all gone, and we're out there. And in historical terms, we're not really very used to playing that kind of a role. Secondly, the rest of the world's not used to it. It's uncomfortable having someone so powerful in the world. And it is probably human nature to sort of hope that the big guy on the block gets taken down a peg or two. And I think we're suffering from that. And it's also come at a time when, and I'll discuss this a little later, unilateralism has been a strong force, and that has added to the resentment. And so the United States doesn't now get the benefit of the doubt. We've never been known, really, for brilliant foreign policy. But most of the world said, well, the United States screwed this one up, but they mean well. And unfortunately, most of the world no longer thinks we mean well. And that's a big change. The third, and I think the most important of the forces I want to talk about, is the force of globalization. Now, that's a much overused word in some respects, but I don't know how else to describe it. And I'm not talking about the globalization that the kids protest out in front of the IMF about. I'm talking about not a policy, but a fact. The world is changing. National borders are eroding. And whether you look at capital flows, which each day dwarf anything that any country does in managing its currencies, whether it's health, where an epidemic can spread worldwide simply by virtue of the airline travel around the world, whether it's the environment, or global warming, greenhouse gases. No country can deal with those by itself. Commerce. The nature of commerce is changing in many ways, but one in particular which affects us. For years, the great world corporations were vertically oriented. They did everything necessary for their corporate life inside the corporation, manufacturing services and so on and so forth. Not anymore. Now they're horizontally oriented. They get this subassembly built here, they get services over here, they get something here, and our big corporations are instead assemblers and marketers. Now, that is much more efficient, and it makes for a more efficient world because it is getting things, services and products, where they are cheapest. But it brings about inequities and dislocations, and that's what we're seeing now. Corporate profits, if we leave out the subprime issue, corporate profits are really doing quite well, but there's a lot of suffering going on in the labor market. And unfortunately, one of the ways we're reacting is, well, what do we have to do? Put tariffs on. Protect our workers, which is the worst kind of solution for the problem we face. We need to take care of the workers, but we need it in a way which doesn't destroy the wealth that's being created in the world by globalization. The last part is information technology. And there is a real revolution. For most of mankind, the average person knew maybe what was going on in his own village and maybe the neighbor's village, and nothing more. And he didn't care. And the world went on, and he did his little work, and it didn't really matter. Now, there's a radio or a television set within reach of almost every person. And so they know as quickly as you do what's going on in the world. And so they react. They react in ways they never have. With envy, love, hate, jealousy, hate, all these kinds of things are boiling up now. And information comes flowing in before governments have a chance to assess. There's a microphone put in front of the head of state. Well, what are you going to do about this? So that is a fundamentally different world. So the people of the world are now politicized. And that makes a very different world. Globalization also makes the governance of weak states more difficult. As I said, national borders are eroding. The United States can manage it. It has effects, but we can manage. But these weak states have real difficulty managing their people because they can't protect their people from the outside world and so on. So they're less able to govern, and that leads to the disintegration of states into ever smaller political units. It leads to drug problems, crime syndicates, terrorism, all of those kinds of things. I think, to me, globalization as a force is analogous to industrialization a couple of hundred years ago. Industrialization really made the modern nation state. When big industries started to grow, the states found they had to regulate, to deal with labor unions, to deal with all the forces that were produced by industrialization. That made the modern state big, powerful, and so on, the states that we have now. And I think globalization is the same kind of force, but it's acting in the opposite direction. It tends to reduce the ability of the nation state to act and to put a premium on cooperation across national borders to get things done. That's a pretty hard thing to do. Now, all of these forces result in a very chaotic world. Difficult to predict, difficult to manage. In a way, the end of the Cold War is like a pressure cooker that somebody suddenly took the lid off. And it's all coming out. And we're trying to cope with it. And furthermore, we're trying to cope with it with institutions and with habits of mind that were geared to the issues and problems of the Cold War. For example, our institutions, I've already talked about the Defense Department. We have a great Defense Department focused still on wars that we're not likely to see again for a while. The same with our intelligence community. For most of its life, it was created at the beginning of the Cold War, and the focus was on the Soviet Union, a single target. We got to know it well. We got to know everything about it. All of a sudden, that's gone, and what's the focus? It's out to 192 states. And we don't even know where the problems are sometimes until they erupt. And when the intelligence community was set up, there was a division between the CIA and the FBI. The CIA did intelligence abroad, overseas. The FBI did intelligence at home. And those two did not overlap. Now, it wasn't a problem in the Cold War because all of our intelligence problems were overseas. Come terrorism, no borders for terrorism. So we have big problems with two institutions who basically have different philosophies and different ways of operating, trying to cooperate across the border. And if you read some of the stories of 9/11 and what did happen and didn't happen and so on, it's a result of that. We're not used to working together on it. Going beyond the United States, we have the same problem, NATO. NATO is a marvelous military alliance. It's the first time, really, that a group of nations have been able to fight together with real efficiency. But what's it for? The original purpose for it has disappeared. We're not going to fight a war within anybody's lifetime on the North German plain. So what's NATO for? Can we take this marvelous military instrument and turn it for a useful purpose in a world for which it was not intended? And I'll get back to that briefly. And the last one I want to mention is the UN. The UN was built in 1945 and its first membership was 51 nations. And those 51 were all similar, not in the way they governed, but in having long histories and so on and so forth. They were organized in similar ways. They'd been states, some of them for thousands of years, but most of them for a long, long time. There are now 192 members of the UN, and most of those additional members either didn't exist at all in 1945, or they were colonies of the 51. And so they have very different attitudes about the world and how the world ought to operate, ought to act, than the original 51. The UN Security Council was made up in 1945 of the powers, of the principal powers in the world who would have to implement any decisions about war and peace. This was the UN way to improve on the old League of Nations. And they did represent power in the world at that time. Now, the world is very different. There's still a remarkable correlation, but there are a lot of other countries that now have a great deal of influence that were not represented. And the UN also has now conflicting responsibilities. The UN was founded on the sovereign independence of its members. And Article 2 of the UN says, "Nothing in this charter shall give the UN the right to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. Quite clear. But since then, we've had the genocide resolution, we've had a number of other resolutions, and there's now a growing sense that the UN has what is called a responsibility to protect. That when a state does not or cannot protect major parts of its own population, it is a responsibility of the UN to intervene. Those two principles are in direct conflict with each other. How do we reconcile them? And Darfur is an excellent example of that conflict, where the UN says we need to act, we say we need to act, and Sudan says, we don't want you in here. And some members of the UN support acting, and some say, no, unless we're invited in, we can't go. There's also a growing conflict between the Security Council and the General Assembly that I'll get back to. But basically, the Security Council represents, if you will, the 51 original members. They're the developed state. The General Assembly, the mass of the 192, really represent the developing world. And those are beginning to believe that the Security Council is being operated for the benefit of the developed powers. And the General Assembly controls money and the personnel. So that's a problem. And then, of course, there are specialized agencies of the UN, and I'm thinking particularly the IMF and the World Bank. Both wonderful institutions, neither one of which are operating anything like their charters say they're supposed to operate. So that's the sort of state that we have inherited. That's our world. That's where we are now. And it's understandable if we don't have a good grip on it. Now let me say just a few words about how the United States has reacted to these changes. The first reaction to the end of the Cold War was relief, relaxation, and probably some drift. There was no longer the existential threat that hung over our heads every day. If we made a serious mistake, we could destroy the world. That was a tremendous burden to have lifted. And in that relief, there was no apparent need for a real strategic direction because there were no great threats in the world. And strategic direction would have been a difficult task in any event because things were changing so fast. So foreign policy tended to become something like charity, an optional opportunity or activity. You could engage in it, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. It didn't matter much because of the lack of the apparent threat and any accompanying imperative to act. And then came 9/11. And 9/11 was a profound shock to America. And I think we underestimate what a deep shock it was. Because enemy attacks were not something that happens in the United States. We haven't really had a war since the Civil War. There was World War II, but it started in Pearl Harbor, which was 2,000 miles out at sea, and so on. We fight wars, but we fight them somewhere else, not here. So this was really a traumatic shock to us. It also awakened us to the fact that there were dangerous things going on in this apparently benign world. And the trends suddenly looked sharply negative. One of the results of this was the surfacing of a philosophical division in attitudes toward U.S. foreign policy, a division which was already long present, but it had emerged in a new and more sharply defined guise. For the first 100 years or so of this country, foreign policy had been characterized principally by Washington and John Quincy Adams. But basically, we conceived ourselves as an example of man's ability to live in peace and harmony with his fellow man. We were the sort of shining city on the hill, an example to all that we hoped they would emulate. But as John Quincy Adams put it, perhaps more specifically than anybody else, wherever the flag of freedom and liberty is raised, there will be our hearts and our minds. But we go not in search of monsters to destroy. We are the well-wishers of all who seek freedom and democracy. We're the guarantors only of our own. And that was our fundamental operating principle for a long time. Early in our republic, when the French Revolution occurred, Citizen Genet, who was the equivalent of the French ambassador here, went to the government and said, look, we helped you in your revolution. We need help in our revolution. And we said, good luck. In 1848, when the revolutions convulsed Eastern Europe and the Hungarians erected statues of liberty and so on and came to us and said, we need help. We said, we wish you well. And that went on until Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson thought that we shouldn't just be the shining city on the hill. We should be evangelizers of democracy. We ought to go out and push democracy and preach democracy. And that we ought to also do this in combination with our friends and allies. His idea, for example, was the League of Nations. Since Wilson's time, there has been a domestic debate within the country as to whether we should, as we go about our foreign policy business, accept the world basically as it is or push democratic reform. After 9/11, this debate took on a new mantle. And the current division, and these are my descriptive titles, I would say, is between traditionalists and transformationalists. And the traditionalists believe that when we go about our foreign policy business, we should do it in association with our friends and allies. As I say, we're the ones who thought up the League of Nations. We're the ones who thought up the UN. We're the ones who organized NATO. That's the way we do our business. The transformationalists said, that's all well and good, but 9/11 showed us that the world is moving fast in a very dangerous direction. We don't have time to reach out to our friends and allies or international organizations. We have this unprecedented power. And while we have this power, we need to use it to transform the world, beginning with the Middle East, into a democratic world. Wilsonism with the use of force is the simplest way to describe it, although it's oversimplified. But that was the emotion that beset us after 9/11. And the transformational approach led us eventually into Iraq to transform the troubled Middle East with a serious democracy deficit, democratize it. Democracies don't make war on democracies, and that would solve the problem. And also, as a side benefit, to demonstrate the awesomeness of U.S. power in a region of the world which respects power. Iraq has turned out, predictably, nothing like the transformationalists had predicted. The stability in the Middle East, which was decried as despotic stagnation, has indeed ended, but it's been replaced primarily by chaos rather than democracy. And many of the separate problems of the region, whether it's in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, terror, have been driven together and exacerbated. Now in a painful process of rethinking our approach to this world. And this process, which is going on now, is being caught up in the twists and turns of an unusually extended election cycle and the crisis in Iraq. As we look forward, what are some of the principles and issues on which this thinking should be based? Let me just give you a few that seem important to me. First and primary, I would say, is a reinvigoration of the Atlantic community. In this world of still uncharted currents, it's essential that those having a common view of man and his relationship to society and government stand together. We and the Europeans have drifted apart, both because of the disappearance of the glue of the Cold War and friction engendered by the U.S. and its new departures in foreign policy. Next, we need to look after as well the unique instrument that I mentioned before, NATO. Can we turn it to good use in the world we face? What should be its relation to the developing European Union? Afghanistan, which is NATO's first, outside Kosovo, ground combat operation, may be NATO's baptism of fire. If we fail in Afghanistan, it could well be the death knell for NATO. But we're having problems, both with European attitudes, a lot of whom think Afghanistan's really a U.S. problem, not a NATO problem. And we're having difficulty acting together in Afghanistan. We each have a piece of helping Afghanistan, but there's nobody watching over all of the pieces. We must also look to the UN in this globalized world. As I said, the UN was built for a different world, but it's the natural refuge to turn in a world that is globalized. Unfortunately, the UN is a very imperfect instrument. But if we didn't have it right now, we probably couldn't create a UN in the world today. Another conference in San Francisco probably would simply not be doable. So what do? Former Secretary General Kofi Annan, 3 or 4 years ago, launched a major reform effort to try to change the UN into a up-to-date, instrument. He largely failed. As I said, part of it was a revolt of the developing world against the developed world, and a sense that, I described before the responsibility to protect, and it sounds like a wonderful humanitarian gesture, but it's looked at by some of the developing world as just another excuse for neocolonialism. That the Security Council with the developed world, anytime they want, can interfere in the developing world under the name of the responsibility to protect. So we have big problems in trying to figure out how we can accomplish this cooperation that globalization says we have to have. Russia. The Atlantic community, I think, needs a common strategy to encourage Russia toward the West. in my mind, Russia is searching for its soul. For about 400 years, Russia has been debating whether it is really a Western society that didn't have the benefits of the Enlightenment, or whether it is basically an Asian society with a Western veneer. We're not going to be able to solve that problem. They'll solve it for themselves. But it seems obvious to me that the best outcome would be a Russia firmly anchored to the West. And that can best happen if we and the Europeans develop a common approach. We need to act toward China in a way which encourages it to become, in the words of Bob Zellick, the former Deputy Secretary of State, a responsible stakeholder. That's a great term. I think that should not be difficult, because as China comes out of its isolation of its earlier communist days, it is realizing its relation to the world. It now needs to reach out for raw materials, especially energy, to the world. It needs markets for its product. It produces far more than it can consume by itself. So it has an interest in the outside world other than just narrow military or diplomatic matters. And thus, rather than try to overturn the world society, like many other challengers to the system have done in the past, I think China is trying to use it and is using it well. And therefore, it has a stake in the system rather than a stake in overthrowing it. If we insist on treating China as a threat, it likely will become one. But I don't see that it's necessary. And finally, I think we need to figure out how usefully to incorporate the Indias and the Brazils of this world into the current power structure. Now, I'm focused almost entirely on the problems of this world, but I think it's important to remember that, troubling as it is, this world does not face the mortal perils which beset the world of the previous century. And I believe if we behave wisely, prudently, and cooperatively, the 21st century could yet end up to be the best we've seen in a rather dismal history of mankind. Thank you very much.
General Scowcroft has kindly agreed to entertain a few questions, so if you'd like to be recognized, there are microphones in the two aisles around the center section. Please, sir.
Generally supposed, I don't think it's yet been proven, but the developing nuclear capability of Iran. What is your advice as to whether or not a preemptive strike to take out that capability should be an option?
Well, we have a slight precedent in history because the Israelis took out the Iraqi nuclear reactor when it was just being built. And the records we have from Iraq is, and I can't remember the numbers, but they had a few hundred people working on it and so on. After the Israelis destroyed it, they had 20,000 people working on its replacement. We can do a lot of damage. We can set Iran back by 3 years, 4 years, I don't know how many years, some years. We cannot keep them from doing it. They can rebuild, they can do it far enough underground, and so on and so forth. I don't think that is the solution to the problem. Well, let me say a little more. I think that Iran is not a monolith. There's a lot of ferment going on inside Iran. I think what we really need to do is to show Iran that the world doesn't want it to go in this direction. And we haven't exactly done that yet. But if we can have a solid, confident front of the United States, the Western Europeans involved, the Russians and the Chinese, saying, don't do this, I believe they'll hesitate. And none of those powers want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But Iran is very skillful at playing one off against another. So it's a matter of our being able to act on our common goal, which is not to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons.
I believe we have a question on the other side.
Yes, sir. Regarding China, how do you see the U.S. policy regarding the PRC in Taiwan evolving over time as China continues to grow in economic importance?
Taiwan. Taiwan is no longer a problem between the United States and China. The problem is Taiwan is a rambunctious democracy. And it could have the ability to bring us into confrontation. About 10 years ago or so, I think China had the impression that time was not on its side, that the Taiwanese, with the dying out of the nationalist Chinese who had come to Taiwan at the end of the Civil War, with the dying out of that generation, Taiwan was becoming more distinct and more independent from the mainland, and they had to act to prevent that. Now the Chinese have a very different notion. As you say, Taiwan is moving. It's a very profitable state. It's a growing enterprise, but their investment increasingly is in mainland China. And increasingly, there is an exchange of people. So the Chinese have now decided time's on their side, that inevitably there will be a consolidation. There is in Taiwan right now a president who is head of the Taiwan Independence Party. And he's going out of office next March. And he wants something to happen. Okay? That literally is a problem. He has a split legislature. He does not control a majority of his legislature. He tries this. His latest is to have a referendum on changing the name of the Republic of China to the Republic of Taiwan. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but it sure does to the Chinese. So we do have a problem, especially between now and next March.
Please.
In your opinion, of the candidates running for either Republican or Democratic nomination, has anyone articulated a clear vision of a foreign policy? And if they, in your opinion, they have not, why not?
I think, and I'm not going to talk about individual candidates. I'm not a politician. I think one of the problems of this election cycle, and I alluded to it slightly, is that we are rightly so consumed with Iraq that it has dominated everything. And my sense is that the Democrats in the election of 2006 didn't advance much of anything. They just accused the administration of incompetence. They said you got into Iraq and you couldn't manage it. Katrina happened and you couldn't manage it. They didn't have to put anything forward. And that's still part of the problem. And the debate so far has been dominated until very recently extensively by Iraq, with the Republicans say we got to stay in there, we've got to make it work, and the Democrats saying, falling all over each other for how soon we can get out. I think now that the Iraq situation is evolving to the point that those rough edges are being rounded off. And none of the none of the major candidates is saying, get out now. There is a much greater realization that however we got in, that Iraq is a huge problem, not just for Iraq, but because it's in the Middle East, which in itself is a big problem. I don't think that the campaign so far has illuminated much. But it's a year away. And if Iraq continues to evolve into a more normal and less preoccupying, we may develop some serious discussion about the circumstances that I've been talking about. How do we cope with this world? What do we do? And this is not a Republican or a Democratic problem. It's a problem of changing the way we think. Now, you young people aren't bound like we are with habits of the Cold War that we've learned for 40 years and we instinctively apply again. But we need to match our thinking to a very different set of circumstances. And I would hope that before this campaign's over, we would start to discuss some of those problems.
General, the mark of a terrific talk is that the time ends before the number of people that would like to engage you have had their say. I hate to cut it off, but on the other hand, I take comfort in two facts. First of all, this is the beginning of the long gala weekend celebration of the Bush Library and the Bush School's 10th anniversary, which you're going to be an integral part of, so you'll be around and people can buttonhole you a little bit further. Secondly, we have an institute with your name, and we hope that we'll be able to count on you coming back, if nothing other than to check up on us and make sure that we're not losing our way. So I ask that you all join me in another round of applause for General Scowcroft.
It's been great to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.